I thought today we could pick up where we left off last week with the whole problem, and it is a real problem, of how you construct a government of people who are created equal and have a right to a say in their government. Now, that's what the Declaration of Independence said, of course, and the I've talked in many places about the relationship between the idea of equality and inequality, and have made the argument primarily in how the South won the Civil War, but also in a series of videos I've done, that the way that the framers, I'm sorry, the founders, I talk about the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence as founders and the people who wrote the Constitution as framers. Um, the founders were able to conceive of the idea of equality because they limited their idea of who could participate in the body politic to a very few people, to white property men for the most part. A few men without property, but for the most part, they were able to conceive of, for the most part, they were white men. For the most part, like I say, there's some wiggling around the edges early on, but that enabled them not to have to think about the fact that enslaved people and indigenous Americans and women and people that they didn't consider equal had any rights at all. So they were able to conceive of the idea of a small group of people having equal rights. And that the reason that there's a fight over that, of course, is it was exclusionary, but at the same time, that principle is expandable. And that's what I find really interesting, because the alternative is to say, nah, we're the only ones who should rule, and society's hierarchical and everybody has a space in, and we white guys are at the top. Alternatively, the idea that everyone is created equal and should have a say in their society means that truly that everybody is created equal and should have a say in their society, although every society does put boundaries around who they consider equal. So, for example, most countries, I say most because when you say all, then people think of the one exception, but most countries don't let children vote, for example. So everybody puts some kinds of boundaries around that already. Alrighty, so the question of how do you do it? It's a real question. How do you create a government in which everybody is created equal and has a right to have a say in that government? What does that mean? Like, how do you do that? And I talked the other day about how under the Articles of Confederation, because the founders were extremely concerned about the fear of tyranny, because that's what they were revolting against, they had created under the Articles a union of states. It was called a friendly alliance of states that retained for the states most of the rights of a government. So in a sense, it was really 13 little republics who were kind of nailed together in a league of friendship. And very quickly that broke apart, in part because the Congress under the Articles of Confederation really didn't have any teeth to enforce any of its rules, including its use of funding. I mean, they could ask the states for money, but they couldn't actually. They had no teeth to get the money, and their different states started to try and get better deals with different other countries to get more trade coming to them. And of course, if New York did that, places like Philadelphia were going to be sunk, and there was a real problem about the Articles of Confederation. But most dramatically, the Articles of Confederation come into disrepute after 1786. And what happens in 1786 is a problem across the country, but what historians tend to focus on is what happens in Massachusetts, because when the war is over, there is a real recession in the economy, in part because the spending of the war has dried up, in part because the British pull out and then tell the Americans that they're not allowed to trade in certain ways, and the economy starts to collapse. And I talked before about the concept of something being not worth a continental. Well, that's the period that this really comes from. And what happens is that in Massachusetts, the people who live in the western part of the state, which is quite rural even still, were close to ruin. They had mortgages on their farms, but they were not able to produce the goods that the amount that they needed to pay back those mortgages, because it was a period of great inflation as well. So they owe money that they can't pay back because prices are low, And because there's a recession, their stuff isn't selling. Nonetheless, they're supposed to be paying their mortgages. And so there's a real fear that they're going to lose their property because of this economic depression. So when that happens in the Massachusetts legislature, the lower house of the legislature said, well, why don't we lower the taxes on those guys and lower their fees and maybe print some more money to help them out, cause some inflation so that they can pay back their mortgages. But in eastern Massachusetts, where the people lived who were holding those mortgages, they said, no way. And they tell the upper house of the legislature not to let that go through. So it doesn't. And when that happens, farmers meet in conventions because they've just gone through the whole idea of creating their own governments with the American Revolution, right? So they start to have their own conventions to talk about reforming the government, to demanding relief measures from the legislature, and even to talk about armed rebellion. And by fall of 1786, there are about 2,000 people in Western Massachusetts who are led by a man named Daniel Shays. He's Captain Daniel Shays. He was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. And they closed down the county courts that are going to be taking people's land because of their mortgages, and they stopped the foreclosures. And it's really unclear that anybody's going to be able to stop them because the state militia, a lot of people in the state militia are actually on the side of Shays. And finally, what puts them down is the Eastern creditors actually create their own private army to put them down. Well, this is a huge problem because it really illustrates that the system under the Articles of Confederation can't protect property. And I don't mean just the property of the creditors, that is the people who want the mortgages paid back, but also the farmers. So the whole economy looks like it's going to collapse. And when that economy collapses and people lose property, lose their interest in land, there's a real problem for the existence of the country because it's going to create huge groups of landless people who are going to attack the government. And one of the pieces that I think is important to remember when we talk about the Constitution or when we even talk about the construction of a government, and this to me is really interesting. So many of the times we think nowadays about politics and we think about sort of moving one bill or another forward or pleasing one interest group or not. In this era, they are literally thinking about the factors that go into creating a stable government. And that's going to continue right through the War of 1812. But they're literally, the thinkers who are wondering about how to establish a government are literally sitting there thinking, what do we do? What's going to work? And one of the things that they are going to focus on after this period in the Articles of Confederation is the need for propertied interests to buy into the government. That is literally, you need to have the people who have property get behind your government or it's not going to succeed. And that's something I've talked about before, of course, with the settlement of Jamestown, for example. But often nowadays, or really since the 1960s, you hear people talking about creating governments that don't necessarily have the support of people with property. And my answer is always the early republic, because unless you get rich people to sign on to your government, they're not going to back it. They're not going to back it financially, and they're not going to back it psychologically. And this is one of the reasons that I worry so much about the rise of a global elite. Because if you are part of an elite, that it doesn't matter where you live because you have homes in many places in the world and your money is all over, you're hiding it wherever, and you have homes in many places. You don't care if the US government succeeds or not, at least not to the same degree you would if you were fully invested in the US government. And I think about that actually a lot. So, Kim, I will. Somebody just asked if I would talk about the abortion vote and the contraception vote. I would be happy to do that, although today is history. So I did actually write about it in the letter, but I will. Today is sort of the walk through history. So come back on Tuesday for the more modern stuff. So they have to wonder what's going to happen. And even before Shays' Rebellion had broken out, people, especially those in Virginia, who recognized the problem of the fact that different states were starting to make their own economic deals with other states, with other political entities, thought that there needed to be a stronger federal government. And Shays really gives that a shot in the arm. So a group of Virginians, as I say, asked the Congress to authorize a meeting of the states to set up uniform commercial regulations, and they do. They meet in Annapolis in 1786, a group of delegates from 5 different states, and very quickly they realize that you can't fix the commercial regulations without also fixing the general structure of the government. So what they do is there they call for a broader meeting, a second broader meeting in Philadelphia. And they call for a meeting in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. Not initially to rewrite a government, but to revise the Articles of Confederation. And the Congress agrees. Now, remember, I talked about how the Congress under the Articles of Confederation was not made up of strong people. It was deliberately kept weak. People cycled in and out of it, and the real brains went to the states. So Congress recognizes that it's a backwater, and it says, sure, go ahead and have a conference to revise these articles and make them stronger. So what happens is that in May of 1787, 55 men go to meet in Philadelphia, and it's a terribly cold, wet spring. Hold on, let me turn my phone off. So they end up having to go through rain and through mud, and it's a miserable trip, but they are able to do it largely because they're so young. And you've probably heard me talk about before how the changes in medicine and in transportation have made our government extraordinarily old right now. We have the oldest government, not the oldest Congress we've ever had. That was actually, I think, one Congress ago. But it's extraordinarily old because if you had to get on a horse or in a carriage and go over mud-covered roads, because we don't have macadam yet, we don't have the kinds of roads that are going to support wheels, for example, it's miserable. And unless you're a young man, you say, I don't want any part of this, and you don't do it. So they're young men, and they are wealthy, so that they're able to travel in decent accommodations and then to stay in decent accommodations when they get to Philadelphia. And delegates come from all the states except Rhode Island. Rhode Island doesn't send them. And they are thinkers. They are people who know what they're doing. We have Roger Sherman from Connecticut. We have Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts. He's going to be the governor who gives the name to the word gerrymandering, but his name is pronounced Gary. It's Elbridge Gerry. I have no idea why. It just is. Alexander Hamilton comes from Virginia. But of course, the driving force behind this meeting is George Washington. And George Washington is the hero of the Revolution, and he comes from Virginia. And he is not going to speak, as far as we know, in this meeting, in this convention. But what he is going to do, if you've seen the room, which is quite small, is he's going to sit on this raised dais on a large chair with a rising sun over his head. And he is gonna look at people and smile when he likes what they say, and he's gonna look at them and scowl when he doesn't like what they say. So for all that he doesn't say anything that we have records of, he is very much a presence in these discussions, and that's going to matter a lot when it comes time to choosing an executive. All right, so what happens is that when they arrive, there is a driving force of the convention, and that's James Madison. James Madison is a young man from Virginia. He is a very small man. If you go to the Madison building at the Library of Congress, they actually have a suit of his clothing in the entryway, and it's quite small. I mean, it's remarkably small. I would say it's like today a 9-year-old boy or something. He's a small man. He dresses in black. He is very intellectual, very bookish, bit of a hypochondriac, and a real thinker. And I would add, I think, a real operator. I think he knows that he can arrange a government in such a way that it gives a huge advantage to people like him. And it's worth remembering that when they meet in Philadelphia, they don't have a census yet. They don't really know which states are bigger than others. They know there are bigger states, but they don't have the numbers on a barrelhead that they're going to have once they start having a census in 1800s. So Madison is going to be able to use this to his advantage. All right. So what happens is that they recognize these are men that have enormous political talent. They've been in the States. They've watched how things played out in the States. They've watched the problems that have happened since the Articles of Confederation. And most of them have either worked in Congress or had drafted their state constitutions, or had they'd served in Congress or in the state governments, or they drafted constitutions. They knew what they were doing. A third of them had been part of the Continental Army. 34 of the 55 were lawyers, and all of them thought they needed a stronger national government. All right, so remember when I'm talking about this Constitution, then, that in that period under the Articles of Confederation, when the states were together in a league of friendship, and that's what how the articles read. It says we the states are coming together in this compact of mutual agreement. They tried that. They don't like that. They figured it doesn't work because pretty quickly the states stop cooperating. They start having their own rules. They start cutting their own deals in different ways, and it means the entire thing is going to collapse, and that's going to make those 13 new states enormously vulnerable. Essentially, they're going to get taken over by foreign countries because remember, England hasn't left. It's just pulled back to the west and up to Canada, waiting for the country to tear itself apart. Spain is down there salivating at getting more land. There are plenty of people who are willing to come in and wipe out those warring states in a hurry. So when I talk about the construction of the Constitution, remember that everybody there recognizes they have to create a stronger government. And that really is going to matter in the way our history plays out. All right, so Madison has given this a lot of thought, and Madison introduces a framework for a new Constitution. And theoretically, by the way, there was supposed to be somebody taking notes, and he kind of pooched early on. So we don't have a very good look at what happened in that meeting, in that room. The windows were closed so that nobody could be listening in and report things prematurely and cause problems, lock somebody into something. And later on, James Madison is going to release his notes from the convention, but it's been pretty authoritatively proven that he wrote up those notes many years after the convention, and he changed some of it in self-serving ways because by then he was politically involved in the government in a different way than he was when he wrote it. So we know a lot about what happened, but you always have to read it with a bit of a jaundiced eye because we know about stuff from later. Anyway, so he proposes a new central government, and his central government has 3 branches. That right there is genius, really. I mean, the whole idea is you're going to have these 3 branches of government that are going to check each other. You're going to get rid of the concept of tyranny by making sure that you're using people's self-interests against each other so that they're not going to worry terribly about the rise of a king, for example, because they're going to give Congress the power to get rid of him. And there's all these checks all over the system. So what he argues is that there should be 3 branches of government, and that's the legislative branch, and that's going to be Congress. And right now, he doesn't have a plan for Congress yet. We're not going to end up with what he starts with. An executive branch, executive meaning, what's going to be the president, and a judicial branch. He wants Congress to be able to veto anything that the states do. He wants an especially strong federal government. That's not going to happen, but that's what he's arguing for. And what he says is this: he goes ahead and tries to develop a Congress, a legislative branch that has 2 houses. Now, remember, I've talked a lot about those 2 houses all the way through American history, and the idea was always that the lower house would represent the people. So they would be directly elected, and the upper house, he wants to be sort of more representative of landed people, essentially. So his plan is to say that the people in the upper house, the Senate, will be elected by the state legislatures. And that should sound familiar because that's actually going to be the way that we elect our senators until the 20th century. We were not going to have direct election of senators. That's going to change, and I'll explain to you why in a minute. And then he wants both representatives to both houses proportioned by population. Well, why does he want that? Because so far as he knows, or anybody knows in this period, the Virginia has way more people than anybody else. It actually doesn't. It's not as big as they think it is. But when they put their system together, Virginia is going to have more electoral votes than anybody else by far. It's way disproportionate. People forget that, and it matters. They're going to get dialed way back in after the census of 1800, and it's also going to matter in the way our electoral college develops. Then he wants an independent judiciary, and he actually wants the executive to be elected by Congress, and that's going to change in just a minute. So they talk a lot about this, and people are deferential to this man who's so smart, but they also are like, nah, we're not so sure. So New Jersey comes up with a plan, and they say, we think this idea of proportionate representation sucks. Although that's a modern day version. I don't suspect they used that word, but I don't suspect they didn't use profanity either. That is, I suspect they did. I could be wrong. And New Jersey says, let's go ahead and get rid of all these new ideas, and we'll keep the Congress we've got, which essentially doesn't have any power. We're just going to give it some power to tax and to regulate trade. And everybody should have one vote in Congress. Every state should have one vote in Congress, because we're a weeny little state, and we don't want to have to fight Virginia. We want to have our own say. So they fight about this for a while. And after about 4 days, the delegates vote down the New Jersey proposition. But it's pretty clear that there's going to be a huge problem in the what's the word? Not delegation, the conference, convention. In the convention between the big states and the little states, because the little states don't want to give up all the power to the big states, and the big states certainly don't want to be vetoed by the little states. So what they end up doing is summer comes, they lock down the place because they don't want anyone to listen in. It gets incredibly hot. And finally, they put together a conference committee to find an answer. And the driving force of that conference committee is Benjamin Franklin, who's 81 years old. It's obviously held in his city, so he can go to it. He probably wouldn't if it had been somewhere else. And they come up with a compromise. And their compromise is this. Their compromise is that in the lower house of Congress, representation will be proportional. So big states will have an advantage. In the upper house, every state will get two senators, two people to represent them. And those will be appointed by the state legislatures. It's kind of a genius plan, to be honest, but I'm not done yet. Then what are they going to do about concerns that about having a tyrant who can start to raise taxes without representation on the part of the people? They guarantee that only the lower house can originate revenue bills. Most people don't know that's there. It's still there. Now they have a workaround that they use now, so that if in fact the Senate wants to originate something, they do what's called a dummy bill. And then they come up with a plan, and when the House of Representatives actually goes out and writes a bill, they insert that into the dummy bill. But to this day, the House of Representatives is the only body that can initiate a revenue bill. So that's designed to keep the people in charge of the revenue of taxation, so that there will always be taxation without representation. But listen to this system as well. So what they decide is that house should be very close to the people, So it turns over entirely every 2 years. The House of Representatives turns over in its entirety every 2 years. Those people have to run for office every 2 years. But what about the Senate? Like, you don't want them turning over. You want them to be a brake on the mob, on the people like those who follow Daniel Shays. So how are you going to do that? Well, you don't really want to have a whole different set of elections, because then some people show up for one thing and not for others. So what they do is they decide that the Senate will turn over a third every 2 years, but only a third. So a third of senators turn over every 2 years. That is, senators have a 6-year term. So people in the House have a 2-year term, people in the Senate have a 6-year term. And then literally they're known as classes. So I don't know how they did it at the Constitutional Convention. I'm sorry, at the first election. I know when later territories come in, they literally draw straws to see who's got the shorter term. But if you are ever interested in your senator and the Senate seat, unlike the House of Representatives seats, which are sort of at large, they're not at large, they're by districts, but those seats are not like I had his seat, he had that seat, they had that seat. The Senate seats are in an unbroken chain. If you were in a seat that turned over the first 2 years, you are still in that seat. So you can actually look up your senator and it will say, Susan Collins holds the seat that belonged to so-and-so, that belonged to so-and-so, that belonged to so-and-so. And those seats all have lineages. So if you think about our system, the Congress is supposed to turn over the House of Representatives turns over every 2 years. The Senate is a break on that. It doesn't turn over very often. But that Congress does a number of things. When they wrote the Constitution, the first thing they write about is Congress. So it's often called first among equals because it's the first thing they dealt with. It has the power to tax. It also has the power to get rid of the executive. That's really big. So the House, it alone has the power to impeach the executive. So the people can say, screw you, we're done with you. And impeachment does not have to be about crimes. My great example is a president could sit and play video games all day. That is not against the law, but we could impeach a president for doing that because we would think that they weren't doing their job, and we'd be right. And of course, they don't have laws yet, so they can't say it has to be about breaking laws. But the House has the right to impeach a president. But to make sure that you don't get, again, the sort of mob saying, we just don't like this guy, we're going to change him out, the Senate turns itself into a judicial system, into a court, and they hold a trial with the idea that members of the Senate are going to be so jealous of their prerogatives, of their own power, that they're not going to let somebody like Richard Nixon or Donald Trump get away with stuff because they're going to stop it. Because in this period, they don't have a concept yet of political parties. They think, hey, we got rid of the king's people. We're all in this together. We don't need political parties. And that is going to be a problem from day one because they're writing this as if everybody's on the same team, and they're not going to be very quickly. All right. So they write that, and then they have a problem of representation. And I hope this jumped out to you. If in fact you're going to apportion the states by the people in them, what do you do about the fact that a number of the southern states, the population, the male population, because we're not talking about women at this point, is largely Black Americans? Are you going to let them vote? I mean, obviously, that's, I think, where things should have gone, but that's a story I'll get to in a bit. They don't want to let enslaved people vote. They don't consider them people who could be members of the body politic. But if you then turn around and say to the people in Virginia, yeah, you can count, or in South Carolina, yeah, you can count all these enslaved people who don't have a say, then you got yourself a real problem because you've created, in a sense, a rotten borough where people get power and then they don't use it for the people in it. So they have way too much power. So they decide they're going to split the baby, if you will, and count enslaved African Americans and indigenous Americans, by the way. But enslaved, there aren't that many at that point. That's because they've been sold away. They certainly were enslaving indigenous Americans. They're going to count them as 3/5 of a person. That's obviously going to cause a huge problem for across the board, but in terms of creating a government, it's a problem in the early years because it gives a huge leg up to the enslavers in the American South. It's going to be a problem after the Civil War when the war ends in 1865 and Andrew Johnson immediately gives power back to the enslavers. And then we're facing the census of 1870 that is going to count African Americans as full people. That's going to mean that Southern white leaders are more powerful after the war than they were before. And it's going to cause a problem in the late 19th century in the territories in the American West, which are places like South Dakota and North Dakota, which was originally Dakota Territory, are almost exclusively indigenous. So when they write the 14th Amendment, what are they going to do about that to make sure they don't create the same problem in the South, in the West that they've had in the South? They're going to write the 14th Amendment and say it covers everybody except Indians not taxed. So that whole issue of representation from the beginning is going to cause a really big problem. All right, so they have this idea about what representation should look like. They also, in the fight between the slave owning states and the states that are increasingly non-slave owning, they have to figure out what to do about the slave trade. And this is the trade that brings Africans from Africa, especially the Gold Coast, over to, I think I talked about that in this series, over to the Americas. And it's an extremely profitable trade. It's also one that many of the founders and the framers find extraordinarily distasteful for any number of reasons. And I'll talk about that more going forward. They also have the issue that nobody really thinks that the system of enslavement is going to last and be very profitable in North America. And the timing here really matters, because what's going to make that system enormously profitable is the rise of a very profitable cotton industry, which is going to take off in 1793. So we're just before that. They don't know that's coming. So they can kind of pretend that enslavement isn't going to last. And that's going to affect what they do. So what they say is that we're going to get rid of the slave trade in 1808. And we're going to kind of hope all this goes away. And they talk about it less than you would think that they're going to talk about it, because again, they're sort of thinking broadly and hoping this is going to go away, but also it's still part of the world. South America enslaves people, other countries enslave people. It's not in the forefront of the minds of the framers. Now, a lot of people say, oh, well, they're just bound by their time. And yes, but it's certainly on the table that enslavement is not okay. And you know, you can see some of that mentality around us nowadays, I think. When so many of our decisions were made with the concept that fossil fuels were just here. People have known they were a problem for a very long time, and they've said we're going to have a really big problem here. And other people who were lawmakers simply drowned them out. So it's not that they didn't know enslavement was a problem. This is not like we're all happy and jolly here, but they didn't force themselves to recognize the problem it was. They kicked the can down the road. All right, having done that, then they had to figure out what to do with the executive branch. The executive branch is what was really going to worry them, right? Because they were worried about tyranny and what were you going to do? And there's George Washington up there. Maybe we can get him. So what they do, first of all, with the executive branch is, as I say, they try and hem it in. So one of the first things they do is they say Congress can get rid of you. You don't have to commit a crime. Congress can say, we don't trust you and you're out of here. That's very powerful. And that's one of the reasons when we had the two impeachments of former President Donald Trump, that I talked myself blue in the face, saying the issue here is not just the president. The issue is the Senate Republicans who are defending him, because the framers did put into the Constitution a way to take care of the rise of a tyrant. They did that. They didn't see the rise of political parties, though. And so the Senate Republicans were willing to say, we don't care. We don't care what he did because he's a Republican and he's giving us tax cuts. And that to me was the real breakdown of the system. Anyway, so if you are going to create an executive, well, you're not going to create him for life because that's a tyrant waiting to happen. You don't want him every 2 years because then he's going to change real fast. But you also don't want them 6 years because that's more like a senator, a wise senator. So what are you going to do? Oh, I know. We'll give them a 4 year term. And if people like him, they can elect him again for a 4 year term. And originally, they did not put a limit to how many 4 year terms one could have. That's going to come after FDR pretty much decides he's going to be king. You know, he's going to keep being elected forever. Um, so you've got him turning over, but not as often as the Senate. Now, since the very beginning, there's been a move to give presidents a 6 year, 1 6 year term, simply because basically a president spends the first 4 years running for the second 4 years. But the only people who've put that in place were the Confederates during the American Civil War. All right, so they say he's going to be every 4 years, elected every 4 years. But do you really want the Shays guys figuring out who they want? Because listen, and I'm picking on them. They're not literally talking about the Shays people. I'm trying to use them as an example of people who participated in the American Revolution, but when it came time to writing the Constitution, the framers kind of thought were maybe not um, the people that they wanted to put absolutely in the driver's seats, although they do want them driving the lower house of Congress. They want them driving the House of Representatives. So the problem is, somebody like Daniel Shays or the people following him, they're not going to know who the real leaders in society are. I mean, even by car today, the where Shays was from is a more than 2 hour drive from Boston down the Mass Pike in a modern day car. They're way out there in the Connecticut River Valley, and they're not going to have any idea who the real movers and shakers are and who the really great people are in the country. So what are you going to do? How are you going to get around this and give them a say in their government without actually handing the government over to them? And they come up with what we now know as the Electoral College. And what they say is that those regular people should choose electors, presidential electors, who will meet together, and they should be men of substance who read the newspapers and have connections in different states and will be able to evaluate a Samuel Adams or a Patrick Henry or a Button Gwinnett, any of the people who are there in the um, Constitutional Convention, thinking, people like me should be here, but not people like him. So they're going to be able to evaluate how good those people are. And what they expect will happen is that the Electoral College will meet. They'll fight because the electors from Georgia are going to want their guy, and the people from South Carolina are going to want their guy, and people from Massachusetts are going to want their guy. And at the end of the day, they're going to be able to agree probably on 2 or 3 people, maybe fewer, maybe a bit more. And then it will go to Congress. It will go to the House of Representatives. I'm sorry. Yeah, it'll go to the House of Representatives, where everybody gets a single vote. When that happens, where each state gets a single vote, and that's where they will choose the president. And they do that in part because they want there to be a difference between the Congress and the Electoral College, because they don't want the Congress to be in charge of picking the president, because it gives it way too much power. And that's actually going to be one of the things that gives us the institutional rise of political parties, so that we have a system outside of our governmental system to nominate the president. And that was really quite deliberate in the early 19th century. And people make the mistake sometimes of thinking our political parties are part of our government. They are not. They are absolutely not. And again, the framers didn't see this coming. They thought the Electoral College would get us away from that. Now I think that I'm going to go a little bit further with the Electoral College now, because people do get confused about it. We needed it then because we didn't have modern media, and people, as I say, from Georgia wouldn't know who the good guys were in Massachusetts. Obviously, we don't have that issue any longer, but the Electoral College almost immediately got perverted. And what I mean by that is, I keep saying that Virginia, under this system, was given more electoral votes than it ought to have had. And that's going to be corrected after the census of 1800, because that's the other thing that the Constitution is going to do, is it's going to give us a census every 10 years so that we can reapportion our voting system, which is actually kind of smart too, right? So that you can, if some state suddenly goes huge, it's not going to be beholden to, what is now a smaller state. And you could see as places like Philadelphia and New York and Charleston were growing, you didn't know who was going to end up being in Boston, who was going to be the winner and all that. As late as the 1840s, There's a town in Maine that thinks it's going to rival New York. It doesn't, but it thinks it might. So they don't really know how that's going to play out. So as I say, Virginia has a lot of electoral votes in this early period. So what happens is, and I will talk more about this, but as you know, the expectation is that the first executive is going to be George Washington. And one of the reasons so many people are willing to give power to the executive branch is because they trust George Washington after the Revolution. And after and there's no limits to how long he can be president, and he steps down after 2 terms, which is huge. The idea that somebody would walk away from power and hand it to someone else is truly unthinkable. And then, of course, that's going to happen later on after the election of 1800, when Adams steps down and hands power to his chief rival. I mean, that is mind-boggling. That sets this idea that Americans are going to transfer power peacefully. And one of the reasons that the January 6th insurrection was such a big deal, we had always transferred power peacefully, except in the case, of course, of 1860, when the southern states left. And I, of course, will tell you more about that as well. Anyway, Buchanan does hand over the presidency to Lincoln. Anyway, what happens is that after Washington steps down, Jefferson recognizes that he's got a problem, because in that election of 1796, what happened in the Electoral College made complete sense, and it's the way what was set up to be done. The Electoral College split. So members of one state didn't all back the same person at first. You had proportional representation in the Electoral College. But Jefferson figures out that if his delegation would stick together and back him, rather than splitting and having some of them go behind Adams and then having the other ones kind of go along so that Adams won that election, he figures out that if Virginia had stuck together in a winner-take-all system, he would have become president. And that's exactly what happens. He convinces the Virginia delegation to do a winner-take-all system. And this makes, of course, Hamilton ballistic. It also makes James Madison ballistic, because he says, this is crazy, because we're going to end up with a system where all you have to do is go to the big states and they're going to be able to put you over the top in the Electoral College, which is exactly where we are. Hamilton went so far as to say he wanted the Constitution amended after Jefferson did that. That did not happen, but by 1820, virtually all the states have adopted a winner-take-all system, and that is a huge perversion, obviously, of the way the system acts. And now I'm going to jump you forward to 1929. After the census of 1920, the congressmen in this period from rural districts recognized that they were outnumbered by people in urban districts for the first time ever in history. So they just said, we're not going to keep on adding members to the House of Representatives. And they capped the House of Representatives. And that has disproportionately, very badly hurt the larger states. If in fact we had continued to grow as we had in the early years before they capped the House of Representatives, I think we'd have over 1,000 people in Congress now instead of the 438 in the House of Representatives we have now. I think that's it. I get a little confused with numbers. And what that means, of course, is that our Electoral College is strongly skewed now toward rural areas instead of the urban areas. And of course, when the framers made this deal, they didn't understand, of course, the concept even of things like steel frame construction, which really takes off in about 1873 and enables us to have cities that have more than 3 stories. Changes everything. We get skyscrapers of 11 stories tall. It's crazy, right? In the 1880s. So the system as they set it up was designed to answer a specific problem, which it did quite well. That problem, the lack of media that we can get information about, is no longer a problem. And we've added these 2 other problems to it as well. So, I'm one of the people who thinks we need to fix the Electoral College, at least by making it actually representational and by increasing the relative weight of the different regions in a way that they were designed to do, or simply by getting rid of it because we don't need it any longer. It's crazy that you can win the popular vote in this country by by more than 1 million votes and still lose the election. That's just very 17th century, isn't it? Anyway, or 18th century, I guess. Anyway, so that's why they have the Electoral College. Um, then by the time they get down to the third branch, the judiciary, I kind of joke that they were just tired and they're like, yeah, whatever, make a judiciary. There's actually very little in the Constitution about the judiciary. The judiciary is supposed to weigh in on things, but just how and what they are supposed to do is unclear. How many people are supposed to be in it is also unclear. That number is set by Congress. That's something that's come up a lot lately. And how they are supposed to weigh in is also unclear. So we're not going to get the concept of judicial review of of whether or not something is constitutional until 1803. That's actually constructed by the Supreme Court itself. So the judicial branch is out there to check the other two. It's supposed to have its own body of power, but they haven't really articulated what that looks like or who it needs to be. So one of the things about the Supreme Court, for example, is people seem to think you need to be a judge to have been a judge in the past to sit on the Supreme Court. That was not the case. So, at the beginning, we literally get one of our first great justices, John Marshall, when he goes to give to the president a resignation letter from the previous Supreme Court Chief Justice. He doesn't want the job anymore. And the president, Joanne, my friend Joanne told me this. The president's like, crap, we need a new Supreme Court justice. Who should we nominate? How about you? And that's how we got John Marshall. And obviously I'm dramatizing it, but it wasn't like there was any balancing this, balancing that. It was like, we need a live body to put in that chair. So what happens is then they get this system. They get a system in which you have this Congress that turns over at these different rates, that is designed to slow rapid change, but still be responsible to the people. Congress has the power to tax. It has the power to regulate commerce. The state legislatures lose power. They can't levy their own import or export duties. They can't coin money. They can't get rid of contract obligations. And they can't conduct their own foreign relations, all of which they had been doing. The laws of Congress under this new system will be the laws of the land, and that will take precedence over any legislation that is passed by the states. So again, when people just ask, for example, now I'm going to try and work it in for you, about Congress and the legislation to protect the right to contraception, the right to use birth control, that would have been a federal law that if in fact the Republicans had permitted it, I'm sorry, it hasn't gone before this. Has it gone before the Senate? I don't remember. They're going to filibuster it. That was an attempt to take over for where the Supreme Court appears to be going, that it is no longer going to protect our right to use birth control, which a number of states oppose nowadays. And I'm going to talk more about the 14th as we go forward. And you certainly have read me on the 14th. And you're going to read me on the 14th again because we're coming up to the date of its passage. And I like to talk a lot about it on that date. But that's for later on. In any case, then, they also said that the Constitution could be changed so long as you had 2/3 of the vote of both houses of Congress agreeing to propose an amendment, or a convention of 2/3 called by 2/3 of the state legislatures, and that you did the ratification of an amendment to the Constitution so long as 3/4 of the states had approved it. So there's a way to fix this law as well. It's really kind of a genius system if you think about it. I mean, it's certainly got errors, but not only did they create the system, they gave us a way to change it, which is again astonishing. And this is before there are any laws. This is when they are still figuring out what a government should look like, because the one they had wasn't working. So on September 7th, 1787, 39 of the 42 delegates who were still there, some had to go home, signed the Constitution. And there's this wonderful speech by Benjamin Franklin, who's old, and he says, I don't know if it's going to work or not. I know it's good, but I wish people would just give it a try, because I'm 81 years old and I know I'm not infallible. It's not what I would have written, but I don't know that I'm right. So let's give it a try. It's just a really disarming, wonderful speech that he gives, and that helps put it over the top. They had been given the permission to the authorization to revise the Articles of Confederation, and instead they wrote an entirely new government. It is an entirely new government. It's a new system, and crucially, it is a new principle. Because instead of saying this is a compact of friendship among the states, the Constitution begins with a pronoun, if anybody gets that reference. The Constitution begins by saying, we the people. So it's not putting the states first, it's putting the people first. And that's a crucial change. And don't think for a minute they didn't know what they were doing. They were deliberately weakening the power of the states. And this is going to be a fight that has continued until today over the relative importance of the states versus the federal government. So they recognize that the state legislatures are going to say, screw you, we don't want any part of this. You're taking away our power. Remember, all the strong guys went to the state legislatures? So they say that the people have to ratify the Constitution. They have to have their own ratification conventions in which they will vote on the Constitution, and that once the people of 9 states have agreed to it, it will go into effect. So they quite deliberately create a government of the people, again, by saying we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. Whereas the Articles of Confederation said we the states. We are the states are coming together in a league of friendship. All right. So then what are you going to do? Now you got to get people to get behind it. And this is a lot. This is a real big deal for a group of people who just fought against tyranny to say, oh yeah, maybe we were wrong. Maybe we want a president, a chief executive after all. I'm thinking no, right? So they take to the streets, they take to the newspapers to convince people of their argument. And this is where we get the idea of the Federalist Papers. And I always find this enormously confusing because what they did is they co-opted the wrong language. So federal means that it's a bunch of little pieces together, right? So their position should be reversed. The Federalists should have been in favor of the Articles of Confederation, and the Anti-Federalists should have been in favor of the new Constitution, but it's the other way around. So the Federalists are arguing in favor of the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists are saying, forget it. We don't want any part of your new government. So the people who don't want part of the new government are saying exactly what you would expect them to. They're saying, you guys just created a freaking tyrant. We want no part of it. We don't like the idea of a separate national government. It's going to be corrupt. It's going to be arbitrary. It's going to tax us. It's going to create a new aristocracy where you can't possibly have a government over this large a territory. It's going to tear itself apart, and then we're going to be easy pickings for a European power. And the people who live in your capital, which they haven't really established yet, it's going to be in New York for a long time. They're going to be too far from the people, and they're going to turn into tyrants, and we're all just going to tear each other apart. Let's stay the way we are, these small little republics, and we'll work together when we have to. And if we have to wiggle that around the edges a little bit, we can do that. So the winter of 1787 to 1788 is enormously important because James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, now they're going to be at each other's throats within a matter of years, but they come together to write the Federalist Papers, and many of them are going to be written by Madison because I think Jay gets sick early on. They're not written under their names, but they're published in New York because they must have New York come on board this new organization, or it's all going to fall apart because New York has the port of New York City. So they know they've got to have New York on board. And what they do is they hash out in the Federalist Papers all the questions about whether or not this system's going to work. And you've all heard of Federalist number 10, I suspect. And it's famous because in it, Madison says, you don't have to worry about all these little factions tearing each other apart because there are so many pieces to it. And that'll mean that people will make alliances on this side and alliances on that side, but they won't end up becoming tyrants and taking over the system because it's big. It's not too big to succeed. It will become effective because it is big. It's a really beautiful sleight of hand, and it's a really interesting thing because Madison's big thing is getting rid of the establishment of a religion. And his argument for getting rid of an establishment of religion is the same for his argument about creating a government. He says, so long as you have a whole bunch of religious sects competing for adherence, you're not going to get tyranny of religion. It's when you give one group a leg up, and he was concerned mostly about Christian religions, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, all the different groups that could tear at each other. It's when you get the ascendancy of one, that's when you have a problem. And that's sort of what he is talking about in Federalist number 10. So what happens with the after the winter in which people are hashing out whether or not they want to get behind this new government, what happens is the anti-federalists say, okay, we'll agree to sign on to this, but we want explicit protections against tyranny. And Madison and the people who are arguing in favor of the Constitution say, okay, we'll amend the Constitution and make the changes that you want. And that's going to be the hold on. That's going to be the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, also known as the Bill of Rights. All right, so what happens is that when I'm going to do the Bill of Rights next, and I'll do ratification. What happens and it's very important when you think about the Bill of Rights, is to recognize that that's why they write the Bill of Rights, to push back on a federal government. They're making sure that they are not creating a tyrant. So the first 10 amendments to the Constitution squeeze the government. They're not doing what modern day originalists argue, giving individual rights to people like the right to bear arms. They are saying this is what the government can't do. They're not saying this is what you can do. They don't think of rights that way in this period. They're saying this is what the government can't do. It can't take away the right of free press. It can't take away free speech. It can't establish a religion. They're pushing the government away in those first 10 amendments, saying these are things the government cannot do in order to protect individuals. They're not saying these are rights an individual has. They're saying these are things the government can't do. And that doesn't seem like it's a big distinction, but it really is a big distinction. Because if you think about the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, they only apply to the federal government, right? That was the whole point. They're the Bill of Rights. They belong to the federal government. It is with the period after World War II that the Supreme Court starts to use those. They did a little bit before that, if there's a legal scholar here, but they really start after World War II using the courts to say, state governments can't do that either. State governments can't write laws that say you can't use contraception, which is discriminatory. State laws can't say gay people can't get married. State laws must treat everybody exactly the same. So those push back on the state laws, and the Supreme Court starts using the 10 First Amendments of the Constitution and applying them to the states. But so it's important to remember that those first 10 rights, the first 10 amendments, are pushing back on that stronger federal government. Because they're not yet conceiving of individual rights. That's going to come way later. They're really thinking about the big picture of government and the fear of creating a tyranny. All right. And then we get the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, then we get 11 and 12, and then we're going to start to get laws that increase the power of the federal government with the 13th in 1865. All right, so on June 21st, 1788, 9 out of the 13 states have ratified the Constitution, and that means it goes into effect for those 9, and the rest are going to follow suit until New York ratifies the Constitution in July of that year. In September, the Congress that has just now been basically thrown out of work certifies that new Constitution, says yes, it's in effect, and it sets the presidential election for that winter from December of 1788 through January of 1789. with the idea that the new government is going to go into effect in the spring of that year. And in April of 1789, George Washington is going to take the oath of office. And that seems like a good place to leave this for today. The Constitution is, I don't know, about you. I used to have to read the Constitution as when I was in school all the time. And there was a lot of language I didn't seem to understand. And I felt like it was a lot longer than it actually is. It's not very long, really. And it's really a remarkable document in terms of what it does. It's also a remarkable document in terms of what it doesn't do. So one of the things that jumps out, or maybe to you, it didn't to me, but what jumps out the more you study it is that it's a wonderful machine. It's a wonderful machine. But there really aren't people in it yet. And that's going to be part of what's going to happen in the early Republic phase when Americans, and I don't mean lawmakers necessarily, people from all sorts of walks of life, try to figure out how to insert themselves into that machine so that it really is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, as Lincoln will call it in 1863. All right, thank you for being here. And I'm off to record this week's Now and Then, which is on a totally out of the surprising and totally cool topic. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I guess that drops probably next week. Thank you for being here.